Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're looking at the xDuoo MT-601 tube or hybrid amplifier actually. It's a combination of a tube stage and a solid state stage to give you sort of the best of both worlds in some ways. But I'll explain that more as we get into the review. For now, let's take a look at the MT-601. I want to start off with a huge thanks to HiFiGo for sending me the MT-601 for review. As you listen to this review, if you think it sounds like a good product for you, I'll put a link down below through to HiFiGo where you can buy the MT-601 for yourself or anything else from their store, of course. There's no kickbacks or affiliates there. It's just a way of saying thank you to HiFiGo for sending out the unit. The xDuoo MT-601 is the entry level for xDuoo in their range of tube and hybrid amplifiers. It's a pretty compact unit, as you can see here. It's not hugely powerful, as we'll talk about in a moment, but at the same time, it only costs $89 US. So you're getting a lot of product in terms of a quality design, a great looking device, and as I'll talk about, pretty solid sound quality for just $89 US. That translates to about 116 Australian dollars on the HiFiGo site if you change currencies, but of course different locations may have variable pricing, so if you're looking at a local Australian store, you may find it costs more than 116, but then shipping costs might vary too. So that's just a rough indication of the conversion from $89 US to 116 Australian dollars. The key point here is this is a very, very affordable amplifier. It puts it in line with some other options like the $99 amps from Shit Audio, which sadly I don't have here right now to compare to the 601, but I will give you a little interesting comparison later, or hopefully interesting comparison later on, with another solid state amp that's even cheaper, but by the time you make a couple of little tweaks to it to get the most out of it, sits at roughly the same price as the 601, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's talk about the design of the 601. First and foremost, this colour scheme that xDuoo have landed on, I think is a real winner. They've got this beautiful kind of gunmetal grey casing. It's sort of a satin finish, so it's not glossy, but it's not completely matte either. And it's actually got a slight two-tone effect with black panels on the sides and on the back. So I really like the overall combination of the aesthetic, including the red volume knob as well. The amp's pretty simple overall. We've got a power switch, we've got a 6.5mm output for headphones, we've got the volume control itself, and then we've got an auxiliary in on the front. Flipping around to the back, we've got the power input, so this uses an external, it's not actually a wall wart, it's an inline power supply. So you've got a plug to the wall, a cable, then you've got a box, a bit like what comes with some laptops, and then another lead that comes up to the 601. I personally prefer that. It tends to make it easier to plug in multiple devices to say a power board, and so it does make it a lot easier. Moving on along the back, we've got two sets of RCAs, we've got an auxiliary input, which is basically a line input, and we've got an auxiliary output or pre-out for powered speakers, power amplifiers and the like. So this is also a tube preamplifier should you wish. Now unfortunately I'm currently not set up to test the preamplification properly. I will be very soon, but I'm not quite there yet. So for anyone looking at this as a dedicated preamp, I can't comment on that, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to tell you lots about how it sounds as a headphone amp, and you should find similar qualities and characteristics through the preamp output. Sitting on top of the amplifier here, you can see a tube. Now if I remove that tube just quickly, it's a small size tube, very similar to tubes like the 12AU7s, 12AT7s and the like, but it's actually a 6N11 or an E88cc tube. So they're not quite as prolific as the 12AU7s, 12AT7s, etc., but there are plenty of them available. As I understand it, it's a tube used in a lot of Chinese devices, so there's no doubt going to be lots of these tubes being produced out of China. Before you get too excited about me tube rolling in this video, I haven't done a lot of tube rolling here because I have a massive tube amplifier review coming up that has so many tube rolling options included in it that I just didn't have space to do any further tube rolling at this point. I did a little bit recently in the Aurus Audio Utopia review, and I've got a bunch coming up in the upcoming Elekit TU8200R tube amplifier review. So stick around and stay tuned for that one. Make sure you subscribe if you're interested in tube amps. It's going to be a big, interesting review, I think. For now though, let's get back to the MT-601. So you've got a single tube here. This is working in the input stage of the amplifier, and that's essentially where the signal comes in, gets processed by the amp, and then sent through to the output stage, which is where the actual amplification, I guess you could say, is applied. But don't be mistaken in thinking that the input stage isn't important. It's probably where the majority of the sonic character of the amp is going to come from, particularly when there's a tube involved. Essentially what's happening here is the input stage is taking the incoming RCA signal and turning it into the waveform that's then going to get passed through and increased in amplitude to be put out to your headphones or your speakers. So it's a really important part of the circuit and should never be underestimated. In my experience with various tube amps, the input stage is normally the most susceptible to sonic changes when rolling tubes. So that gives you a bit of an idea that some tube rolling with the MT-601 may bring about some nice sonic changes, some bad ones too potentially, but the key point is you've got the versatility of tweaking it and changing it should you wish. Other than having an input stage with a tube, the MT-601 is a Class A amplifier, meaning that it runs in the least efficient way, but in theory, the best possible way for sound quality. Now that is debatable because there's some wonderful AB designs and the like these days, but generally speaking, Class A is considered to be the best sounding amplification because it's often the most pure version of the process, if you like, of increasing the amplitude of the sound. Now what I mean by that is that a sound wave has positive and negative, and so in a Class A amplifier, the same device is swinging all the way through the positive stage into the negative stage. Whereas in an AB amplifier, there's one half of the circuit doing the positive and another half doing the negative. That does allow it to be a bit more efficient because they're only turning on and off as needed, but at the same time it introduces problems where one side of the circuit is switching off and the other is switching on. So without getting into further technicalities that firstly I'm not fully equipped and qualified to talk about, but also that I don't think we really need to understand, what we need to know is that Class A is the simpler circuit design. It is less efficient, which means it's going to get hot, and I'll talk about that in a second, but it can result in a cleaner, purer sound for lower cost because it's a simpler circuit. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that it generates some heat, and I have to say the MT-601 does get very, very hot. It's still comfortable to touch, but only just. And that's not uncommon, A for a tube amp and B for a Class A amplifier. So by combining both here, both tube and Class A, we are generating quite a bit of heat. Looking at the 6N11 tube in the MT-601 when it's running, it also is glowing quite brightly, which says to me it's running fairly hot in the scheme of things. As I understand from different tube amps I've looked at over the years, some amps will run the tubes quite hot, whereas others will keep them at a lower level of exertion, I guess you could say. It looks to me like the 601 is putting a bit of strain on that 6N11 tube, but it also might be the characteristics of these tubes. I haven't seen them in other amps before. So don't put any huge weight on what I've just said, other than the fact that it's going to run hot, but it's completely fine. I've run it for a couple of hours the other day when I was listening to music, editing videos, doing all sorts of stuff, and it was absolutely fine throughout with no problems at all. While we're speaking heat, we probably should talk about power. Despite all that heat, the MT-601 has fairly modest power output in the scheme of things. It produces 200 milliwatts into 32 ohms, which is actually plenty for most headphones, as I'll talk about shortly. And that means that if you're running a higher impedance headphone, like say a 120 ohm HD560S, you're dropping down into the 50 odd milliwatt range. Now that may sound like nowhere near enough power, but to put things into context, the HD560S requires only 10 milliwatts in order to reach 120 decibels. So in other words, the MT-601 has 5 times more power than it needs to drive the HD560S to dangerous levels. Now, I'm not sitting here suggesting that you should run a pair of HiFiMan HE6s from this, but I am suggesting that it's going to be completely fine for most headphones on the market. And indeed, I've run it through a bunch of different headphones here, and there's not a single one that hasn't sounded fine with it. Perhaps my most difficult headphone across the board for most amplifiers is the DT880 250 ohm, and despite having twice the impedance of the HD560S, the MT-601 drove it with no problems at all, and I couldn't even get close to maximum volume without causing myself discomfort. So all in all, what you need to know is the MT-601 will have enough power for any headphones you want to use, unless you're going into some of the really difficult planar magnetic territories, at which point I'd question why you would be buying a budget headphone like this to drive those very expensive planar magnetic cans. This is a budget headphone, and you should think about it accordingly. It's going to be great paired up with budget to mid-level headphones, but realistically, if you're playing at the higher level headphones, you're not going to get the most out of them with this amp, as we'll talk about now with sound quality. Enjoying this video? If you are and you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, there are lots of ways you can help, and most of them don't cost you a cent. You can help for free by liking this video, subscribing and ringing the bell, sharing this video on social media or your favorite audio forums, or by making your next purchases using any of the affiliate links in the description. Obviously that's not technically free, but you're not spending anything extra and it all helps out. Want to go a step further? You could buy some merchandise, t-shirt, hoodies, caps and the like, or you can join the Passion for Sound family on Patreon. It's a growing community with plenty of interesting discussion and your chance to influence what happens on the channel. Check out the description for more information and links where relevant. But for now, let's get back to the video. The MT-601 sounds good for an affordable level tube amp. It's not a great amplifier in the overall scheme of things, but it's a good amplifier for its price. I would describe the MT-601 as a great entry point into budget audiophile desktop amplification, and tube amplification at that. It's not going to go out there and beat more expensive amplifiers, it just doesn't perform that well. But for its price, it performs just fine. To give you some more specifics on that, the mid-range from the 601 is a little bit thicker than some other comparable amplifiers, and that's probably coming from the tube. That's not to say that all tubes are going to be thick though, it just depends on which tube is installed and the overall design of the circuit. Now, having not tube rolled the 601, I can't say which of those it is, but it's an amplifier that I would certainly be comfortable recommending at the price, knowing that you can try some different tubes and see what effect they have. At this price point, it's a great way to start toying with tubes, trying a little bit of tube rolling without jumping in too deep. Detail retrieval is generally pretty good for an amp at this price, again keeping in mind it is a tube amp and using a budget stock tube that may not be the best option for audio resolution. I found the bass was probably a little bit looser than truly neutral and well controlled, but at the same time it's completely fine. I didn't notice significant roll off in the bass from an audible point of view. I didn't do any measurements, but from an audible point of view, and so that's telling me that the hybrid design is taking care of that extra bit of bass extension that some pure amps like the recently reviewed Douk U3 don't always manage. It's one of those trade-offs with a pure tube amp design versus a hybrid amp design like this. Both of them have their pros and cons. In the case of the hybrid, it's going to be better at delivering current to lower impedance headphones. It's also going to often handle the bass extension better than a similar pure tube amp. That's not a hard and fast rule, as my bottlehead mainline has proved to me over and over again. There are tube amps out there that do great bass extension. But in this case, I found the bass extension to be very good from the 601, the bass control and tightness to be a little bit less than what I would say as being perfectly controlled, but again, let's put it into context for the price, it's doing a great job for an $89 headphone amp. Finally, let's talk about soundstage. The 601 produces a fairly intimate, closed-in soundstage with a very tight central image focus. The image isn't perfect and holographic or anything like that, but it's very well focused in the center. The only issue is there's not a great deal of space around that central image for all of the other instruments. So things do feel, I wouldn't say congested, but they don't feel as open and expansive as you're going to get from a high level amplifier. One really important thing I need to mention is that when you're powering on the MT-601, it's going to make a pop through your headphones. Powering off's not such an issue, but when you're powering on, I highly recommend you don't have the headphones plugged in and at least have the volume control all the way down. It's a very quick way to potentially destroy a pair of headphones and also hurt your ears. So it's a bit of a shame that it doesn't mute the output circuit when switching on, but at this kind of price, I also understand it not being in there. So just a quick warning, make sure you unplug your headphones before switching this guy on and off. Overall, I'd say that the MT-601 stacks up well against its peers in the $89 to $100 price range, particularly knowing that you can roll tubes and change the sound a little bit, but you shouldn't expect it to be outperforming more expensive amplifiers. For example, something like the shit Asgard 3 over here behind me will easily outperform the 601 at double the price. So it's all going to come down to whether or not you've got more budget or not, as opposed to whether or not this is better than the more expensive amplifiers. If you have the budget, I would recommend spending more. If you don't have the budget, this is a great place to start still. But if you have the budget, let me throw one little wrinkle in the mix. One of the viewers of the channel, and I think a patron as well, recommended that I try out the Douk Audio U3 amplifier. Now this is a really budget, I think it's around $40 solid state amplifier available from Amazon, AliExpress, similar places like that. It's a nice little compact design. You can see it's probably a little bit smaller still than the MT-601 here, and it's a pure solid state design with a swappable up amp. It doesn't come with any power supply, so you do have to find yourself a 5-volt power supply. But that's actually really good news because you can easily use a simple battery power pack in order to feed this thing. You'll just need to get the right connector to go from USB to a DC input. Once that's done, you can also throw in something like a Burson Audio V5i op amp, and suddenly having spent about the same on this as you have on the MT-601, if we don't include the battery pack that hopefully you've already got, then you've got yourself an amplifier that's actually going to outperform the MT-601 by a fairly comfortable margin. And I only share that to say it's worth considering your options. The MT-601 is the only one of the two that is going to give you the ability to tube roll, play with tubes, experience what that's all about. Also, it's the only one that's got the preamp output if you're going to be using it with a power amplifier or a pair of active speakers. So they've both got their pros and cons. This is probably more of a true desktop system, whereas this is a little bit more of a portable type unit. So they've got their pros and cons, but I wanted to flag that at the price point, yes, this is a good tube amplifier, but you can spend the same and get better performance, or you can spend more and get much better performance with something like the Asgard 3. To provide a bit more detail, when you do step up in performance to something like the Douk Audio U3 or an Asgard 3 or similar, what you're generally going to be getting is a bigger sense of soundstage, a greater sense of layering and depth in the soundstage, and also better detail retrieval. The MT-601 is fine, it's solid for an $89 hybrid tube amp, but it's not the last word in sound quality. And I think it's really important that you set your expectations coming in. I'm not for a second trying to talk you out of the 601. I think it's a really nice little amp and I've loved having it on my desk. It's going to be great to bring a bit of extra warmth and body to some of the leaner headphones out there because of that extra bit of mid-range that it has. But at the same time, it's not a headphone amplifier that you should think of as endgame by any stretch. I can also imagine that somebody pairing this with a higher end headphone like say an HD6XX or a pair of HiFiMan Sundaras might feel like the headphones aren't giving them what they've heard everyone else talking about, and that's because of the limitations of a budget amplifier. Higher quality headphones deserve a higher quality source, and this is a budget entry-level source. It's a good one, it's a really solid one, but I just want to make sure expectations are well and truly grounded. So to wrap all this up, the MT-601 is a great budget entry-level hybrid tube amp that I would highly recommend to anyone wanting to dip their toes in the water of audiophile sound and or tube amps for tube rolling opportunities. It's a great way to play, see what might be possible, see what sound is like when you've stepped beyond the output from your PC, your laptop, etc. This is a nice way to take that first step. It could add some extra power and oomph from a simple dongle DAC, like say a Tempotec Sonata HD Pro or a Dragonfly or an Earman Eagle. Any of those, it could provide that extra bit of power and also a bit of coloration from the tube. So it absolutely has a place. I don't mean to for a second throughout this review suggest that it's not a really good amp for its price. But I also want to make sure it's really clear that it's not the be all and end all and it's not beating things at a higher price point. If you have more budget to spend, I recommend that you spend it. If you're looking at sticking around this price point, the MT-601 is absolutely worth considering. It's a great little amp, it's going to be lots of fun to listen to, and you can always roll tubes to try different colorations of the sound and potentially improve the characteristics that I've described here. Once again, if that sounds good to you, do make sure you jump through the HiFiGo link down below to say thank you to them for this review. As I said earlier, there's no kickbacks or anything, it's just a matter of saying thank you and helping to keep products like this coming to me so I can share them with you. If you found the review useful, as always, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and hit the like button to help this review review get in front of more people like you and to help me bring more reviews to you in the future. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.